Hello, and welcome to our presentation, which is one of the articles in the collection, Cultivating Critical Consciousness Through Digital Video Inquiry. We hope to give you a little short preview of our article and hope that you will come read and spend some more time with it. I'm DoerrStevens from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
I'm Melissa Gibson from Marquette University, also in Milwaukee.
So we have two lenses that have been brought together that are informing this work.
One is the idea of problem-posing pedagogies from Paulo Freire, the form of social inquiry, collective social inquiry that stands in contrast to the banking of content.
And another lens is that of critical digital literacy, which extends critical literacies into the realm of digital texts and online contexts, asking how we read power, how we create power and circulate powers in different ways in online contexts, and how that shapes social practices as well. So our work is drawing from two different contexts, from larger studies in two different contexts. The first is Crosstown High, a high school, a 9th through 12th grade high school in a mid to large urban Midwestern city in the US. And the demographics of this public high school were very similar to this city that the high school was in, or that it is in.
The second site is Americano in a large Latin American city. It's an elite international private school serving from nursery school through 12th grade. Within the school, there is a program called the Innovation Academy. It's sort of a school within a school for high school students where they engage in interdisciplinary, humanities-based, project-based learning for social responsibility. And that's where the data from Colegio Americano comes from.
So the bulk of our article is really going into these digital video inquiry practices that we identified from across our contexts and our studies. And we feel that these are really spaces where this problem posing pedagogy really happens for the students and can happen in the class. So the first is formulating a question. The second, immersively experiencing the world. The third, selecting media elements. And the fourth, crafting a story. And we hope to share just a brief example of each of these.
So in formulating a question, we highlight the story of Sergio, a student who was investigating the fishing industry in which his father was a global executive. And his teacher, Mr. Bill, pushed students to think of their question asking as being a Socratic gadfly of asking hard questions. And through this process, Sergio came to ask a question about interdependence between his father's own company's profits and smaller artisanal fishermen. And this process led him to uncover new perspectives, to see his world anew. And by asking these hard questions and getting new perspectives, he actually came to see his own role and his own future differently. He saw himself, he had changed ideas about himself that grew from the kind of question that he asked.
So in addition to crafting a question and composing a question as a problem-posing practice in itself, during the making of these documentaries, the students were required to actually experience these topics as well. So going beyond just researching the topic, but to experiencing it as well. And so in one example in this, with the City Pulse, which was a documentary made about the city bus, the students creating this, the 3 students creating this documentary had very little experience on the city bus. And so through making this documentary, they were required to experience the city bus by riding it a certain amount of times, by interviewing those who are dependent upon the bus and other insiders within the city bus riding culture that they defined it as. And through doing this, they were actually pushed. They met a family that relies on the bus. They met a man that they identified as a homeless man and had a real conversation with him. So they had real conversations with people who rely on the bus and who create the culture of the bus, which they really focused on in their documentary. And so through this experience, their views of the bus and perceptions of the bus definitely diversified and became more complex, but also their understanding of what diversity is beyond just a word. They started to see diversity in this as an asset that they have not only on the bus, but in their school as well. So they started to reflect on how this is happening in their daily life as well. Another problem posing practice that we saw was that of selecting the media elements to actually include in the presentation of this inquiry to others. And so this here is an image of the iMovie interface where all of these elements are at hand and they are positioned together into this narrative. And in this particular example within City Pulse, the media element of music was very influential in their thinking about the topic, but also in thinking about how they wanted to present this topic to their audience. And so here we have Chandra, who's talking quite a bit about how she was intentional with her music selections during the transitions and that she wanted to create an emotional experience for the audience that was also similar to their emotional experience as they investigated the city bus. She talks about starting out with a hopeful emotion and tone, then going into a thoughtful and mysterious emotional tone, and then ending with an advocacy tone of advocating for more public transportation. So the music was very influential in affecting and pushing and pulling on their questions and the shaping of the narrative of what they are presenting.
And the fourth entry point for problem posing in the documentary process that we identified is this overarching process of crafting a storyline. So in this case, I highlight the story of Anapao and Aleda, who were doing an economic inquiry into the quinoa industry, which they did not have a personal stake in. They were just interested in what was going on in the quinoa industry with quinoa prices globally. And as they gathered data and as they interviewed perspectives, they realized that the story that they told was essentially an argument. And they began to see that the crafting of a storyline was also an act of advocacy and mobilization. So while they were teaching about this economic concept and relationship, they chose to highlight and to profile in particular the perspective of the original Andean farmers of quinoa. They begin their documentary with their perspective and they end their documentary with this perspective, which stood in contrast to how many of the people in their elite school and community viewed the Andean culture within their country and Latin America as not being the real Latin America. And yet they chose to highlight this perspective in order to tell the story that is not often told and to advocate on behalf of policy changes.
And so as you can see, these four practices, they do not happen discrete and separate from each other. They very much interloop and influence each other. You can kind of hear that in the different practices that Melissa and I were highlighting. But we feel this video inquiry process has a lot to offer classrooms and learning and engagement in the future.
So for one, digital video inquiry is really a kind of intellectual self-determination where students are asking the question, and of course their teacher is facilitating that process, but they're asking the question, they're uncovering the sources, they're digging into the perspectives, and then choosing what story to tell. And this process of intellectual self-determination can, on the one hand, lessen resistance to the sense of being indoctrinated or being forced to learn about social issues. They are in charge, right, of this process. Certainly, it also means that students can choose not to engage and not to engage critically, which we talk about in the article and give examples of.
Also, building on this self-determination is the media composition element, the digital media aspects of it, in that in creating this narrative and thinking through these questions with media, the filmmakers or the media makers have access to various cultural assets, such as popular culture, such as music, such as cultural references among their peers. And all of these become resources for them to critically analyze their positionality related to the topic and place themselves within that to move forward.
And finally, digital video inquiry is sort of a meta democratic practice in the classroom, both in terms of the content and the dispositions that are being cultivated through this process, but also in the enactment of democratic practices in the classroom, as students are sharing epistemological and pedagogical power with their teachers through this process.
So we close with links to seeing the whole documentaries if you would like to see them, the student-made documentaries. We know we offered only a slice of them, but if you want to see the whole piece and keep in mind the layers of problem posing that were happening during the production of this, we invite you to view them. These are links where you can access them. And also here are our references if you would like to explore some more of the ideas that informed our thinking. So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.